I'm here under the great pines of Miller Park to offer the invitation to a practice on this second week of Lent. How's it going? Trying to do a little praying outside in these last days. Well, today's invitation is to consider taking a piece of sacred text. Could be scripture, could be a psalm, could be actually a poem that you pull out of the medicine cabinet that's been working on you and read it aloud to the more than human community surrounding you. Ched Myers, who's an activist and biblical scholar, especially of the Gospel of Mark, has offered in his essay about watershed ecclesiology a number of tips on how to consider ecology when we're reading scripture. He calls them tips for hermeneutics, taking the word permaculture or permanent culture and adding it to hermeneutics, which means the lens of seeing the world, particularly from our tradition. One of the tips he suggests is to try to imagine the ecological setting, the bioregional context of the scripture. In particular, notice the agrarian references or the references to the more than human world that are so much more abundant than we've often given the scripture credit for. A second is to allow ourselves to live inside the story, to see what is coming up out of the ground, and not to yank it from its context to serve whatever purpose we want it to serve. So for instance, this week's anticipated scripture for Sunday is the Garden of Gethsemane in the Gospel of Mark, the 14th chapter. And, I have to admit, I haven't really spent all that much time imagining before what that midnight context was like. Jesus doesn't go to the edge of the temple in Jerusalem. He doesn't go to a synagogue in Bethel to offer that most heart-wrenching prayer to Abba. He goes to the Garden of Gethsemane in the middle of the night. What were the textures of the leaves? What were the possible aromas at that hour? He probably was sitting on a rock. What was that like to pray that prayer sitting on such a steadfast foundation as he anticipated being handed over to not only authorities, but in some way giving over in this passion narrative. Willis Jenkins in The Future of Ethics says, religion's role today, as it's been for many generations, is that those of us with a tradition, we learn to work within our tradition to renegotiate, to redeploy the stories in order to meet new contextual demands. And I think that's what this practice is really about, because so often the abuse of scripture is because it has been deracinated. It's been pulled up by its roots, taken out of its context, its ecological, mythological, and cultural context to serve something that is ultimately destructive to human life and life altogether. So we have the opportunity to read scripture, not to just duplicate what happened in the first century Galilee, but to begin to coax our imagination into understanding what is our role and purpose, what are our relationships